The night was a suffocating blanket of darkness, the kind that made every shadow seem alive. Matthew, a young photographer chasing rumors of eerie rural landscapes, found himself on a desolate dirt road. The crunch of gravel under his boots was the only sound, aside from the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the bushes. The air was unnaturally cold for summer, carrying with it an unshakable sense of dread. Ahead, silhouetted against the faint starlight, stood an abandoned barn. Its warped wooden beams twisted upwards like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, and its roof sagged under the weight of time and secrets. Matthew paused, his flashlight beam trembling as he swept it over the structure. The barn's entrance gaped like a yawning mouth, its door half off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. Surrounding it, the earth was riddled with hoof prints, some fresh, as if an invisible herd had gathered there moments ago. Yet the silence was deafening, broken only by a faint, ghostly hum. It wasn't quite music, but a strange, rhythmic resonance, as though the ground itself were vibrating with something ancient and restless. Intrigued and unnerved, Matthew took a step closer, his breath clouding in the unnatural chill. The flashlight flickered, then died, plunging him into the suffocating dark. Just as his heart began to race, a dim glow emanated from within the barn, pulsing like a heartbeat. The light was pale and cold, spilling through the cracks in the wood like tendrils of mist. Matthew swallowed hard, his curiosity battling his survival instincts. A faint odor reached his nose, something metallic and sour, like the tang of blood left too long in the sun. His camera felt heavy around his neck, as though weighed down by unseen eyes watching from the shadows. As he approached the threshold, Matthew noticed something strange, scratch marks gouged deep into the doorframe. They weren't random, they formed an eerie, spiraling pattern that seemed to draw his gaze inward. His fingers brushed the markings, and a jolt of cold shot through his hand, making him stumble back. The hum from within grew louder, transforming into what sounded like muffled whispers. They weren't in any language he recognized, yet they clawed at his mind, filling it with a primal fear he couldn't explain. Peering inside, Matthew's breath hitched. The barn's interior was impossibly vast, far larger than it appeared from the outside. Hanging from the rafters were lanterns that flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the empty space. The shadows they created seemed to dance, twisting and writhing as if alive. At the center of the barn stood a ring of old wooden chairs, each facing inward, their seats covered in a fine layer of ash. On the floor, etched in something dark and glistening, was an intricate symbol, a spiral identical to the one on the doorframe. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a chilling laugh, soft at first but growing louder, echoing through the barn's hollow expanse. Matthew turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. The faint glow intensified, and he swore he saw shadows moving out of sync with the flickering light. Panic gripped him, but his legs refused to move. His flashlight sputtered back to life for a brief moment, casting its beam across the room. In that fleeting second, he saw them, figures standing in the shadows of the chairs, their forms barely human, with faces blurred as if smeared by an unseen hand. Their eyes were pinpricks of white light, unblinking, locked onto him. One of them took a step forward, its footfall silent, yet Matthew felt the vibration deep in his chest. The whispering began again, more insistent, a chorus of voices overlapping in an otherworldly harmony. They weren't inviting him, they were commanding him. Matthew stumbled back, his hands fumbling for the door behind him. The wood was ice cold, and no matter how hard he pushed, it wouldn't budge. The light from the lanterns dimmed, plunging the barn into an oppressive twilight where the shadows seemed to stretch and reach for him. And then from the center of the barn came a sound he'd recognize anywhere, the distinct click of a camera shutter. Only it wasn't his camera. Something unseen was capturing him, documenting his fear, his helplessness. The cold metal of his own camera pressed against his chest as if mocking him for daring to enter this place. And then a voice, deep, guttural, and echoing with an unnatural cadence, whispered from the darkness. "You're already part of the dance." Matthew froze as the barn fell silent again, save for the rhythmic pounding of his heart. Matthew stood paralyzed in the center of the barn, his breath shallow as the echoes of the guttural voice faded into the suffocating silence. His flashlight had died again, leaving him at the mercy of the faint, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the floor. The spiral symbol etched in the center now appeared alive, shifting and writhing like a nest of snakes. For a moment he thought he could hear it, an almost imperceptible hiss, as though the symbol itself was whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Instinctively, he reached for his camera, gripping it tightly as though it were the only tether to his reality. The cold metal felt heavier than before, unnervingly so, and as he lifted it to inspect, his fingers brushed against something that hadn't been there before, a faint engraving on the side of the lens. He angled the camera toward the glow to see it more clearly and felt his stomach drop. The spiral symbol was now carved into his equipment, impossibly precise, as if it had always been there. Suddenly, memories began to surface, fractured and hazy, like glimpses of a long-forgotten dream. He was a child again, no older than 8, playing hide-and-seek in the sprawling fields of his grandparents' farm. The memory sharpened, and he remembered running into a barn just like this one, laughing as he hid behind a stack of hay. But then the laughter had stopped. The air had grown heavy, and he had heard the faint sound of music, the same ghostly hum that now filled this cursed place. The memory shifted, and he saw his grandmother's face, her expression unusually stern. She had grabbed his arm with a grip stronger than he thought her capable of, and dragged him away from the barn, muttering under her breath, "Never go there. They'll see you. They'll want you." As she pulled him back toward the farmhouse, he had glanced over his shoulder. Through the half-open door of the barn, he had seen something. Dark figures swaying to music only they could hear, their movements disjointed and unnaturally fluid. Back in the present, Matthew's head throbbed as the memory faded, replaced by the oppressive reality of the barn. The glow intensified, casting his shadow onto the warped wooden walls, but something was wrong. His shadow wasn't alone. Behind him, faint outlines began to form, shadows of figures that hadn't been there moments before. They moved subtly, just enough to make his skin crawl, their heads tilting at unnatural angles as though observing him. He turned abruptly, but there was nothing there, only the empty barn, its silence more threatening than the whispers had been. And yet, the shadows on the wall remained, growing darker and more defined with each passing second. His pulse quickened as his eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might explain this waking nightmare. His gaze landed on a small object partially buried in the ash at the center of the spiral. It was an old, weathered photograph. He hesitated before picking it up, his hands trembling. As he dusted off the ash, he felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. The photograph depicted a group of people standing in front of the barn, their faces blurred as though smeared by an unseen hand. But it was the figure in the center that made his blood run cold. A young boy, no older than 8, holding a camera identical to his own. It was him. Matthew's knees buckled, and he staggered back, dropping the photograph as if it had burned him. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and rising in urgency. "You've been here before," they seemed to say, their tone both accusatory and mournful. The spiral on the floor began to pulse, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the barn wasn't empty anymore. He saw them, the figures from his childhood memory, swaying to an invisible melody. Only now their movements were jerky, almost marionette-like, and their heads twisted unnaturally as they turned to face him. Their mouths opened wide, but no sound came out, only the agonized hiss of air escaping their lungs. One of them stepped forward, and Matthew recognized the tattered dress of his grandmother, her face a twisted mask of sorrow and anger. "Why did you return?" she rasped, her voice layered with something otherworldly. The glow from the spiral grew blinding, and the barn seemed to stretch and shift, its walls bending inward as if the entire structure was alive and breathing. Matthew stumbled, clutching his camera as his grandmother's shadow loomed over him. "You brought them back," she whispered, her voice trembling with despair. "You've reopened the door." Before he could respond, the spiral flared one final time, and the barn was plunged into darkness. The whispers ceased, leaving only his ragged breathing and the faint click of his camera, which had inexplicably taken a picture on its own. The barn was suffocating in its silence, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but alive, brimming with unspoken menace. Matthew stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum summoning something ancient and malevolent. The photograph lay at his feet, its edges curling as if scorched by invisible flames. His grandmother's shadow had vanished, but her words lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable. "You've reopened the door." Suddenly, the spiral in the center of the barn began to shift again, its lines twisting and reconfiguring into something new, an intricate sigil pulsating with an otherworldly glow. The light wasn't warm but cold and biting, piercing through Matthew's skin as if searching for his very soul. From the sigil rose a figure, its form indistinct at first, a swirling mass of shadows and light. As it coalesced, it took on a vaguely human shape, though its proportions were unsettlingly wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its movements unnaturally smooth, and its face was an abyss, a void that seemed to draw all light into it. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that clawed at Matthew's sanity. The figure raised a hand, long and skeletal, and the whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep, guttural, and commanding. "Choose." The word echoed through the barn, resonating in Matthew's bones. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him began to close in, their edges sharp as blades. He realized with dawning horror that the figure wasn't giving him an option to refuse. The sigil on the floor split into two glowing paths, each leading to a different corner of the barn. One path flickered with a dull, crimson light, the other shimmered with an eerie, sickly green. The voice spoke again, its tone dripping with malice. "The red path grants escape, but at a cost. Leave, and your memories of this place, and all that you love, will burn. The green path binds you to the spiral. Stay, and your body remains, but your soul becomes mine. Choose, mortal. Choose now." Matthew's breath hitched, and his mind raced. His memories burned? His soul bound? Neither choice was a true escape, only two paths leading to the same abyss. He glanced at the crimson path, and a flash of his life outside this nightmare flickered before his eyes. His apartment, his friends, the mundane warmth of coffee on a quiet morning. It all seemed impossibly distant now, like something that belonged to another person entirely. But the green path, as he looked closer, he saw shadowy figures standing along its edges. They were barely visible, but their forms were hauntingly familiar. He saw his grandmother, her face contorted in anguish. He saw himself as a child, clutching the same camera that now hung heavy around his neck. And then in the deepest shadows, he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. It was him again, but older, worn, and broken. This version of himself was kneeling at the spiral's edge, his hands clawing at the ground as if trying to escape. His mouth moved, forming silent pleas, but his eyes were empty, devoid of life. Matthew stumbled back, his vision swimming as the barn seemed to tilt around him. The figure in the center of the room tilted its head, its movements unnervingly deliberate. "Time is fleeting," it hissed, the shadows around it rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. "Choose, or the spiral will choose for you." Matthew felt tears prick his eyes as despair clawed at his chest. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his throat was dry, his voice swallowed by the oppressive air. The barn's walls seemed to close in, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a crushing tide. And then he noticed it, something small glinting faintly in the ash near the sigil. It was the amulet his grandmother had given him as a child, the one she had pressed into his hand the day she warned him about the barn. He had forgotten it entirely, but now it pulsed with a light of its own, a soft, warm glow that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. Desperate, Matthew reached for it, his fingers closing around the cool metal. As soon as he touched it, a surge of heat shot through his body, and for a brief moment, the whispers stopped. The figure recoiled slightly, its form flickering as if disrupted by the amulet's presence. Matthew felt a spark of hope, but it was fleeting. The voice returned, harsher and more insistent. "The amulet does not save you. It only delays the inevitable. Choose, or all paths will close, and you will be lost to the spiral forever." Matthew's grip on the amulet tightened, his knuckles white. He looked at the two paths again, the crimson glow beckoning him toward freedom at an unbearable cost, the green light promising eternal servitude. The amulet pulsed again, its warmth steadying him, but it offered no guidance, only a reminder of his grandmother's words. "When the music plays, remember who you are." The whispers rose into a cacophony, the shadows pressing closer, the figure's void-like face leaning toward him. The weight of his decision felt unbearable, but deep down, Matthew knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice he made would change him forever. The barn seemed alive now, its structure groaning as though it were breathing, shifting subtly as if the wood itself were pulsing with some malevolent force. Matthew clutched the amulet tightly, its faint warmth the only anchor against the suffocating cold that surrounded him. The paths of crimson and green still glowed faintly in the corners of his vision, but the barn itself had begun to change, its walls stretching and contracting as if mocking his fragile sense of reality. Then, the whispers began again. This time, they were no longer disembodied murmurs. They felt closer, sharper, as though they were coming from just behind him. Matthew spun around, his breath hitching as he searched for the source. The shadows on the walls rippled like liquid, and from their depths, faint outlines began to emerge. These were not the blurred forms from earlier. They were more distinct, more human, yet grotesquely wrong. Their limbs were too long, their spines curved at impossible angles, and their faces were featureless voids that seemed to devour the light. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence exuding a palpable dread. Though it had no eyes, Matthew could feel its gaze boring into him, cold and unrelenting. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. "You don't belong here," they hissed. "You brought the light. The spiral must not be broken." The figure raised a skeletal hand, and the air in the barn shifted violently, as if a storm had been unleashed within its confines. The glow of the spiral intensified, casting flickering shadows that moved independently of the light. Matthew felt his knees buckle as a wave of nausea washed over him, his vision blurring. It wasn't just fear. Something was invading his mind, clawing at his thoughts, twisting them into shapes he couldn't recognize. "Who are you?" Matthew gasped, his voice trembling as he backed away from the figure. The shadows seemed to laugh in response, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something primal and ancient. The figure's head tilted sharply, and its whispers shifted, becoming a single, clear voice that echoed in the recesses of his mind. "You already know," it said, the words cutting through him like shards of ice. "We have always been here. And so have you." The amulet in his hand grew hot, almost burning, as if reacting to the presence of the figure. Matthew stumbled, the sigil on the floor glowing brighter now, its intricate lines rearranging themselves into something new. He blinked, and for a moment, the barn was gone. He was standing in a field under a sky split with jagged streaks of crimson and green lightning. Around him, the shadows danced wildly, their movements synchronized with the pulsing light of the spiral. The whispers grew more frantic, their words unintelligible yet pressing, urging him towards something he couldn't understand. The barn returned in an instant, but it was no longer empty. The chairs that had been vacant were now occupied by figures, their forms shifting between solid and spectral. Each one turned toward Matthew in unison, their movements jerky, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. One figure rose from its chair, a woman with hollow, glowing eyes. Matthew's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. The same face from the photograph, the same woman who had warned him as a child. But her expression was different now, twisted with anguish and something darker, something far more dangerous. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice echoing as though it came from the walls themselves. "You cannot escape what you are. The spiral has chosen you. It always does." The shadows surged forward, enveloping her form and stretching toward Matthew. He stumbled back, the amulet flaring with light, and the shadows recoiled momentarily, hissing like smoke touched by flame. The barn began to shake, the sigil on the floor radiating a heat that made the air shimmer. And then came the music. It started faintly, a single, mournful violin note that cut through the cacophony of whispers. It was the same melody he had heard in his memory, the same tune that had haunted him as a child. But now it was louder, more visceral, vibrating through the very marrow of his bones. The chairs began to creak as the figures within them rose one by one, their movements jerking as if puppeteered by invisible strings. They began to sway to the music, their bodies contorting in impossible ways, their faces locked in expressions of both ecstasy and agony. The whispers merged with the melody, creating a haunting chant that filled the barn with an oppressive weight. The woman's voice rose above the others, her words clear and chilling. "The dance begins. You cannot refuse it." Matthew felt his body move involuntarily, his legs dragging him toward the spiral. The sigil's light pulsed in time with the music, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. His mind screamed for him to stop, but his body betrayed him, his steps faltering as he fought against the pull. As he neared the center, the shadows encircled him, their forms undulating like smoke caught in a windless room. The violin's wail grew sharper, piercing his thoughts and drowning his senses. He clutched the amulet tightly, its warmth the only thing keeping him tethered to his sanity. "Remember who you are," the voice of his grandmother echoed faintly in his mind, cutting through the chaos. He focused on the amulet, willing its light to grow, to push back the encroaching darkness. The spiral flared brightly, blinding him, and for a brief moment, the whispers stopped, replaced by a silence more terrifying than any sound. And then, from the depths of that silence, came a single resonant word: "Stay." The barn had become a living nightmare, twisting and warping with every beat of Matthew's heart. The violin's haunting melody continued to fill the space, its mournful notes weaving a tapestry of terror that pressed against his mind. Shadows danced wildly across the warped walls, their shapes flickering like flames in a storm. Each shadow seemed to move with purpose, as if mocking him, daring him to succumb to the creeping despair. The amulet in his hand pulsed weakly, its warmth diminishing, as if the growing darkness was sapping its power. Matthew's breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps as a voice echoed in his mind, not the guttural, commanding voice from before, but something softer, more insidious. It was his own voice, or at least it sounded like it, whispering his deepest fears, pulling at the frayed edges of his sanity. "You're not strong enough," it murmured. "You never were. Why fight? Why run? It's easier to let go." His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his hands trembling as he pressed the amulet to his chest. The glow of the spiral on the floor intensified, casting his shadow across the barn's walls. But something was wrong. His shadow didn't mirror his movements. It twisted and writhed, growing larger and more distorted until it stood apart from him, a towering specter of his worst fears. Its eyes, hollow and black, locked onto his, and it began to step forward. The whispers in the barn grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices, each one a reflection of Matthew's doubts and regrets. He heard his grandmother's voice, laced with disappointment, asking why he had ignored her warnings. He heard the voice of a childhood friend he had abandoned, blaming him for their loneliness. And then, cutting through the others, he heard himself, a broken, defeated version of his own voice, taunting him with every failure he had ever tried to bury. The shadow loomed over him now, its form shifting like smoke. It reached out with an elongated arm, its fingers curling into claws. "You cannot fight what you are," it hissed, its voice echoing with a sinister resonance. "You brought this upon yourself. The spiral chose you because it knows you." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward as if the barn itself were alive and intent on swallowing him whole. The chairs surrounding the spiral were now occupied by shadowy figures, each one a twisted reflection of a moment from his past. One chair held a younger version of himself, sitting with the same camera that now hung around his neck, its lens cracked and bleeding shadow. Another held his grandmother, her face etched with sorrow, her lips moving silently as if she were begging him to stop. Matthew's vision blurred, and his head throbbed with a growing pressure. The violin's melody changed, becoming sharper, more frantic, as if it were tearing through his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of himself trapped in the spiral, dancing endlessly with the shadowy figures, his face contorted in a grotesque blend of pain and joy. The shadow extended its claws further, brushing against his chest. A cold, searing pain spread through him, and he gasped as the amulet slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor. The light within it flickered weakly, then dimmed. The shadow's void-like eyes locked onto his, and Matthew felt the edges of his reality begin to unravel. "You fear the truth," the shadow whispered. "You fear yourself. Let the spiral take your pain. Let it consume your fear. Give in, and you will find peace." For a moment, Matthew hesitated. The weight of his fear, his guilt, and his failures pressed down on him like a suffocating tide. The temptation was overwhelming. What was the point of fighting when everything he loved, everything he had been, seemed destined to be swallowed by the spiral? But then, amidst the chaos, a faint memory surfaced. He was back on his grandparents' farm, running through the fields under a golden sunset. His grandmother's voice called to him, warm and steady. "Fear only controls you if you let it." The words cut through the darkness, and for the first time, Matthew felt a spark of defiance. He reached for the amulet, his hand trembling as the shadow lunged toward him. His fingers closed around the cold metal, and a surge of warmth shot through his body. The spiral flared with light, and the shadow recoiled, hissing as if burned. "You are not my fear," Matthew whispered, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "You are not my truth." The barn erupted in chaos as the shadows writhed and screamed, their forms dissolving into the walls. The figures in the chairs collapsed into ash, and the spiral's glow became blinding. The violin's melody twisted into a discordant wail before finally shattering into silence. As the barn settled into an uneasy stillness, Matthew stood, clutching the amulet tightly. The shadow was gone, but its words lingered, etched into his mind like a scar. The spiral on the floor dimmed, its light fading into the darkness, but the barn's oppressive weight remained. The whispers had ceased, but he knew the spiral wasn't finished with him. The temptation to give in had been strong, and Matthew feared that the next time, he might not have the strength to resist. The barn fell silent, but the silence was not a reprieve. It was suffocating, thick with anticipation. Matthew stood at the edge of the spiral, the amulet clutched tightly in his hand. The shadows that had taunted him moments before had dissolved into the walls, but he knew they hadn't left. They lingered, watching, waiting. The spiral on the floor no longer glowed brightly. Its light pulsed faintly, like the last flickers of a dying flame. But Matthew could feel its energy, coiled and waiting, like a predator preparing to strike. From the center of the spiral, the air shimmered, and the shadows began to converge. At first, they were formless, writhing masses of darkness, but slowly they coalesced into a figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly ancient. The figure's face was obscured, its features shifting as though refusing to settle on a single form. Its eyes, however, were fixed and unwavering, twin voids that seemed to pierce through Matthew's very being. "You resist," the figure said, its voice a resonant growl that echoed through the barn. "But resistance is futile. The spiral does not lose. It only waits." The figure raised a hand, and the spiral on the floor flared to life, its light no longer soft but sharp and blinding. Matthew staggered backward as the air around him grew heavy, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't escape. The barn itself seemed to warp and stretch, its walls bending inward, the ceiling rising impossibly high. The spiral's glow cast long shadows, and from those shadows emerged figures, distorted and hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. These were the spiral's victims. Matthew could see it in their empty eyes, in the twisted, unnatural movements of their bodies as they circled the spiral. They didn't walk, they glided, their feet never touching the ground, their limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. One by one, their heads turned toward him, and their mouths opened in silent screams. The figure in the center of the spiral stepped forward, its presence exuding a cold so intense that Matthew's breath crystallized in the air. "You brought the light," it said, its tone dripping with contempt. "You disrupted the balance. Now you must pay the price." Matthew felt the weight of the amulet in his hand, its faint warmth battling against the overwhelming cold. He tightened his grip, his mind racing. The spiral's light pulsed faster, and with each pulse he felt something pulling at him, a force tugging at his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. It was as if the spiral were unraveling him, piece by piece. "You don't have to fight," the figure said, its voice softening, becoming almost inviting. "The spiral can take your pain, your fear, your regrets. It can make you whole. All you have to do is surrender." For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. The weight of his fear, his guilt, his memories, they pressed down on him like a tidal wave. The spiral promised release, a way to escape the torment that had followed him since he first stepped into this cursed place. But then he remembered the words of his grandmother, "Fear only controls you if you let it." "No," Matthew whispered, his voice trembling but firm. "You don't own me." The figure tilted its head, as if curious. "Brave words," it said, its tone laced with mockery. "But bravery alone will not save you." The spiral's light erupted, filling the barn with a searing brilliance that forced Matthew to shield his eyes. When he opened them, he was no longer in the barn. He stood in a vast, endless void, the spiral beneath his feet glowing with an otherworldly intensity. Around him, the figures of the spiral's victims hovered, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Above, the figure loomed, its form stretching impossibly high, its shadow swallowing the light. "This is the spiral's truth," the figure said, its voice echoing through the void. "It is not just a place. It is a part of you, a reflection of everything you fear, everything you hate. You cannot escape it, because it is you." The void began to close in, the shadows creeping closer, their cold touch sending shivers through Matthew's body. The amulet in his hand burned brightly, its light cutting through the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The spiral's pull was too strong, its power too vast. "You have one chance," the figure said, its voice rising to a deafening roar. "Embrace the spiral, and you will be free. Resist, and you will be consumed." Matthew closed his eyes, his mind racing. The spiral was everything he feared, everything he hated about himself. But it wasn't all he was. He thought of the warmth of the sun on his face, the laughter of his friends, the love he had felt and given. These were things the spiral could never take, because they weren't born of fear, they were born of light. "I am more than my fear," he said, his voice steady. "I am more than you." The amulet flared, its light exploding outward in a wave that shattered the spiral's hold. The void collapsed around him, the figures of the spiral's victims dissolving into mist. The figure screamed, its form unraveling, its void-like eyes burning away in the light. When Matthew opened his eyes, he was back in the barn. The spiral on the floor was gone, replaced by a simple circle of ash. The The barn was silent, its oppressive weight lifted. He stood there for a long moment, the amulet warm in his hand, the echoes of the spiral's whispers fading into nothing. But he knew it wasn't over. The spiral was gone for now, but its shadow lingered. It would wait, as it always did, and one day it might return. The barn's oppressive silence returned, but it carried a new weight, a foreboding stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm. Matthew stood amidst the circle of ash where the spiral had once glowed with otherworldly energy. The amulet in his hand pulsed faintly, its warmth now a mere ember compared to the blazing light it had unleashed moments ago. He thought it was over, that his defiance had broken the spiral's hold, but deep down he felt it, an unsettling presence lingering in the air, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. The shadows began to stir again. This time, they didn't slither across the walls or twist into grotesque shapes. They rose from the floor, pooling like ink, coalescing into a single, towering form. It was the figure from before, but now it was fully formed, its presence more solid, more menacing. Its face was still a void, an absence of features that made it all the more terrifying. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its fingers ending in jagged points that scraped against the barn floor, leaving deep, blackened grooves. "You think you've won," the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper but a deep, resonant growl that shook the barn's foundations. "The spiral is not defeated. It has simply awakened." The ash beneath Matthew's feet began to shift, swirling around him in a pattern eerily similar to the spiral that had consumed the barn earlier. He stepped back, his boots crunching against the brittle remains, but the ash followed, crawling toward him like a living thing. The barn itself seemed to come alive, the walls groaned, the beams above creaked, and the air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning wood. Matthew gripped the amulet tightly, its warmth now almost searing, as if it, too, was responding to the figure's presence. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The figure tilted its head, its void-like face exuding a mockery of curiosity. "Lies," it hissed. "I am your fear. I am the shadow that follows you, the regret that haunts you, the truth you refuse to see. And now, you will face it." The ash on the floor rose like a wave, engulfing Matthew in a suffocating cloud. He coughed and stumbled, his vision obscured by the swirling darkness. When the ash settled, he was no longer in the barn. He stood in a warped, nightmarish version of his childhood home. The walls were cracked in bleeding shadow, the air thick with the metallic scent of decay. Familiar objects lay scattered around him, his grandmother's rocking chair, his old wooden toy box, the family photo that once hung in the hallway, but they were distorted, twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. From the shadows emerged figures, each one a reflection of Matthew's deepest regrets and fears. His grandmother appeared first, her face a mask of sorrow and disappointment. "You never listened," she said, her voice hollow. "You brought this upon yourself." Behind her, other figures took shape, friends he had abandoned, moments of failure he had tried to bury, every mistake and misstep he had ever made. They surrounded him, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusation and despair. The spiral symbol began to glow faintly beneath their feet, pulsating in time with their words. "No," Matthew whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. You're not real." The figure from the barn stepped forward, towering over the others. Its presence seemed to drain the light from the room, casting everything in a sickly, gray haze. "This is as real as you are," it said, its voice echoing with finality. "You cannot escape the spiral. It is you." Matthew felt the weight of the words pressed down on him, but he refused to yield. He gripped the amulet tighter, its warmth spreading through his body, anchoring him in the midst of the chaos. He thought of his grandmother's voice, her words of strength and defiance. "Fear only controls you if you let it." With a surge of determination, Matthew raised the amulet high, its light flaring brighter than ever before. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as the light pierced through them. The figures surrounding him began to dissolve, their voices fading into echoes. The towering figure remained, its void-like face fixed on Matthew. "You think light can save you," it snarled. "The spiral is eternal. It cannot be destroyed." The spiral beneath their feet flared to life, its glow twisting and warping as it began to rise, forming a vortex that threatened to consume everything. The figure stepped into the center of the spiral, its form growing larger, its voice rising to a deafening roar. "If you will not surrender, then you will be devoured." Matthew took a deep breath, his grip on the amulet unwavering. "The spiral doesn't own me," he said, his voice steady. "And it never will. With all his strength, he hurled the amulet into the spiral. The light it emitted exploded outward in a blinding wave, cutting through the vortex and tearing the figure apart. The barn reappeared around him, its walls shaking violently as the spiral collapsed in on itself. The figure let out one final, guttural scream before dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, Matthew was alone. The barn was still and silent, the spiral gone, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the floor. He stood there for a long moment, his body trembling, his mind racing. The amulet lay at his feet, cracked but still faintly warm. He picked it up, its familiar weight grounding him in reality. As he stepped out of the barn into the pale light of dawn, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The spiral was gone, but its shadow lingered in his mind. He knew this wasn't the end. The spiral had marked him, and one day it might return. But for now, he was free. And for the first time, Matthew felt the faintest spark of hope. Matthew stepped out of the barn, the pale light of dawn casting long, eerie shadows across the frost-tipped grass. The cool air stung his lungs, but it was a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere he had just escaped. The barn behind him was silent now, its menacing aura seemingly gone. Yet as he looked back, the structure felt different, not abandoned but dormant, as if it were merely resting, waiting for its next victim. The amulet in his hand was cracked, its once warm glow reduced to a faint flicker. Matthew ran his fingers over its surface, feeling the jagged lines that now split the metal. It had saved him, but at what cost? He couldn't shake the feeling that its power had been drained, that its protection was no longer absolute. As he tucked it into his pocket, the weight of it felt heavier, like a relic carrying the burden of everything he had seen and endured. The morning light revealed the landscape around the barn. The field, which had seemed endless when he arrived, now appeared smaller, hemmed in by a dense forest of skeletal trees. The ground was littered with strange markings, spirals etched into the dirt, some small and precise, others sprawling and chaotic. They seemed to radiate from the barn itself, spreading outward like the ripples of a stone dropped into a still pond. The sight sent a shiver down Matthew's spine. These markings weren't random. They were a map, a web connecting the barn to something far larger, far darker. He turned back toward the road, eager to leave the cursed place behind, but the moment he stepped forward, he froze. A faint sound carried on the wind, a violin's mournful melody, distant but unmistakable. It was the same tune that had haunted him inside the barn, and it seemed to follow him now, growing louder with each step he took. Matthew glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadows rising again, but the barn remained still. The music, however, persisted, weaving through the trees like a ghostly thread. "Don't look back," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. "Just keep moving." But the world around him didn't let him go so easily. As he walked, the forest seemed to shift, the trees leaning closer together, their branches twisting into claw-like shapes that reached for him. The path beneath his feet felt uncertain, as though it might crumble at any moment, leaving him to sink into the darkness that waited below. The markings on the ground became more frequent, spirals etched into the bark of trees, carved into rocks, and even burned into patches of grass. It was as if the spiral had left its mark on the land itself, a scar that would never fully heal. The whispers returned, faint at first, like an undertone beneath the violin's melody. They grew louder, more insistent, their words just out of reach, teasing the edges of his sanity. Matthew clenched his fists, trying to block them out, but they weren't coming from outside. They were in his mind, burrowing into his thoughts like parasitic worms. "The spiral is eternal," they said, over and over, their tone both mournful and triumphant. "You cannot escape it. You are part of it now." Matthew's pace quickened, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, desperate to leave the forest and its cursed whispers behind. He emerged onto the road, the dirt path stretching before him, empty and quiet. The violin's melody faded, and the whispers receded, but the air was heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. He glanced back one last time, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The barn was gone. Where it had stood moments ago was now an empty field, the spirals in the dirt the only evidence that it had ever existed. Matthew blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Had the barn truly vanished, or had it simply retreated, slipping back into whatever shadowy dimension it had come from? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through him. If the barn could disappear so easily, what else could it do? Could it find him again? As he stood there, the faint sound of a camera shutter echoed in the still morning air. Matthew froze, his blood turning to ice. Slowly, he raised his camera, turning it on with trembling hands. The screen flickered to life, and he scrolled through the photos stored within. Most were what he expected, pictures of fields, the barn, and the surrounding forest. But then he reached the last few photos, and his heart stopped. The images showed him inside the barn, captured in moments he didn't remember. In one, he stood at the edge of the spiral, his face pale and terrified. In another, he was surrounded by the shadowy figures, their hollow eyes locked onto him. But the final image was the worst. It showed him walking out of the barn, the amulet in his hand. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure, the same towering, featureless entity that had confronted him in the spiral. Its void-like eyes stared directly into the camera, as if it had been watching him all along. Matthew dropped the camera, his hands shaking. The road ahead seemed endless, the forest on either side pressing closer, darker, more menacing. He didn't know where he was going, or if he would ever truly escape, but one thing was certain. The spiral wasn't finished with him. It was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. As he turned and began to walk, the violin's melody returned, faint but persistent, a reminder that the spiral's reach was eternal. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of his vision, he thought he saw it, the barn, standing silently, waiting for its next victim.